Everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, amazing. Great. Thank you everyone for being here. Good afternoon everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second day of the 2023 EPIIC Symposium, Power and Prejudice, Race and International Relations. We just heard two incredible panel discussions today that helped to shed light on the significance of race and racism as it relates to climate change as well as international development and the global economy. My name is Paloma Delgado, and I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for this year's symposium, Special Representative Desiree Cormier-Smith. Ms. Cormier-Smith serves as the U.S. State Department's first Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. Since being appointed, she has been leading the State Department to advance equity and confront systemic racism, ensuring that the human rights of marginalized individuals and communities are protected within the spheres of U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy. Previously, Ms. Cormier-Smith served as a senior advisor in the Bureau of the International Organization Affairs. Ms. Cormier-Smith also worked at the Open Society Foundations as a senior policy advisor for Africa, Europe, and Eurasia, where she led the Foundation's U.S. advocacy strategy and execution on a range of human rights issues. Prior to that, she served as a senior director with the Albright Stonebridge Group's Africa practice. Recently, she has been involved with UN human rights initiatives focused on racial equity. Ms. Cormier-Smith co-led the U.S. delegation at the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination meetings at the OHCR in Geneva in August of 2022. And recently, she supported the inaugural sessions of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent in December 2022, which called for the institutional protection of human rights for African descendants worldwide. Ms. Cormier-Smith, it's an honor and pleasure to have you as our keynote address speaker for this year's symposium. We thank you for joining us today. You may now proceed with the keynote address. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Let me make sure I turn on this microphone. Okay. Can you hear me okay? I don't know if the microphone's on. Okay, there we go. Thank you. I came across the documentary, Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America, while scrolling through Netflix on a lazy Saturday. After seeing the short preview, I knew I needed to watch this film. As a practitioner of racial justice work and as a patriotic American, I immediately recognized who we are as required one. The film examines the true impact of anti-Black racism and white supremacy on the social, legal, political, and economic aspects of the United States. If you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to watch it this weekend. It took me on a journey regarding collective identity and remembrance. In the documentary, Jeffrey Robinson, Executive Director of the Who We Are Project, shines a bright light on the ugly parts of American history that some people would rather forget about or pretend never happened. One of the things that Robinson says in the documentary that has stuck with me, and I'm paraphrasing here, is this: countries, like humans, can be many things at once. Just as no person is purely a saint or purely a sinner, neither is any nation. I immediately started thinking about how this is true, but rarely acknowledged. Like people, all countries have parts of their histories they can and should be proud of, but there are undoubtedly dark chapters in all of our histories that we wish we could change. But wishing those dark chapters away won't negate the fact that they happened, nor would it absolve us of having to grapple with the lingering legacies of these ugly historical events. Then I started thinking about the importance of memory. John Locke, whose works heavily influenced the framers of the Constitution, had an interesting theory about memory. He maintained that a person's identity only reaches as far as their memory extends into the past. In other words, who one is critically depends upon what they remember. Thus, as a person's memory begins to disappear, so does their identity. And while Locke was theorizing about the individual, I think this applies to our collective memories as well. Then, because I'm a foreign policy nerd, I started thinking about what this documentary means in a global context. Who are we? What does it mean to be the United States of America? Who do we want to be? And if you ask me, I'd say that regardless of who we want to be, we cannot get there until we remember and acknowledge who we have been. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Desiree Cormier-Smith, and I'm the State Department's first ever Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. I was appointed by Secretary of State Antony Blinken in June of last year to advance the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, including people of African descent. In this historic new role, I'm working to combat systemic racism, discrimination, violence, and xenophobia globally through our foreign affairs work. The United States has a rich diversity that is undoubtedly a source of national strength and pride. However, practitioners, policymakers, and Americans alike cannot and should not ignore the reality that our country, like many others around the world, continues to grapple with racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, all the results of some of the uglier parts of our history. Though they be ugly, we must never forget them. In the United States, as I'm sure you all are aware, there is ongoing debate about the need to acknowledge the tragic and ugly parts of our history, including the forced displacement of Native Americans from their lands to a manifest destiny we created, and the enslavement of Africans to work in a strange land that was not America's to begin with. It is important to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the ancestral lands of the Narragansett, the Mohegan, the Pawtucket, the Aquinnah, the Wampanoag, and the Pequot peoples. We honor their contributions and resilience today, and I pay respect to their elders, both past and present. It's also important to acknowledge that Boston, as a major port city, played a critical role in the early days of the Middle Passage. The first slave trade expedition from the American colonies sailed out of Massachusetts. The ship Desire left Salem in 1637, carrying Native American prisoners of war to be sold as slaves in the Caribbean. When it returned, it was carrying the first known Africans imported into the Northeast colonies. After this documented case of human trafficking, Massachusetts legalized the enslavement of Africans, Native Americans, and mixed-race people. It is estimated that a total of 166 transatlantic voyages embarked out of Boston. Boston is also where one of the greatest Americans to ever live found refuge from the barbarism of slavery. Frederick Douglass was able to let his love, humanity, intellect, and leadership flourish here in Boston. Douglass began his life enslaved, but went on to become arguably the most consequential figure in the abolitionist movement, inspiring hope for millions around the world. Douglass became a diplomat, serving as U.S. Ambassador to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where he continued his advocacy efforts for equality through foreign policy. His brilliant words, brave actions, and bold diplomacy continue to shape the ways that we think about race, racism, democracy, and what it means to be an American. We are not far from the site of the Pequot Massacre, where in 1637, English settlers murdered over 500 indigenous children, women, and men, then set fire to the Pequot fort, and any surviving women and children were enslaved. We're also not far from where Crispus Attucks, a black man, became the first casualty of the American Revolution in 1770, where he was shot and killed in the Boston Massacre. In what will forever be remembered as a noble fight for American sovereignty and self-determination, it was the blood of a black American, a descendant of Africans, that primed the canvas upon which America would reimagine herself, more free, more independent, with liberty and justice for all. As President Biden says, quote, "We can't just choose to learn what we want to know and not what we should know. We should know the good, the bad, everything. That's what great nations do. They come to terms with their dark sides. And we're a great nation," end quote. We do this work to try and lead by example. We are not the only country grappling with the lingering legacy of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade and how we tell those parts of our history. So what are we doing? As the Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, my mandate is twofold. to ensure U.S. foreign policy, processes, and programs protect and advance the human rights of people belonging to marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, including people of African descent, and to combat systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia around the world. Not because we have solved these challenges here in the United States just yet, but because we recognize that these are global challenges that will require coordinated and sustained global solutions. My mandate was created because the Biden-Harris administration acknowledges the global nature of systemic racism. We also understand that racism can be compounded by the intersection of other identities that are also the targets of oppression. I often get the same few questions immediately after folks hear my mandate, so I'll try to answer them now up front. Often first is, what is the difference between my mandate and that of the State Department's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer? Well, many of you may know that since its founding in 1789, the State Department has been predominantly pale, male, and Yale, so the saying goes. Months after being sworn in, Secretary Blinken appointed Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley as our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, the first CDIO in the department's history. As Secretary Blinken noted during the announcement of Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley, because we are operating in a diverse world, and America's diversity is a source of strength that few countries can match, when we fail to build a team that reflects America, we are less effective. I couldn't agree more. And that's why I'm heartened to see the earnest efforts to increase diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility at the State Department. Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley's team is working hard to increase the recruitment of and identify barriers to entry for underrepresented racial and religious groups, women, LGBTQI+ persons, and people with disabilities to ensure that our diplomatic workforce reflects the rich and beautiful diversity of our country. While the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer is focused on the State Department's internal workforce equity, my team and I are focused externally on our foreign policies, programs, assistance, and messaging, and how we can do our part to combat the global scourge of racism. So essentially, my mandate and Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley's mandates are complementary. Another common question I get is, how can the United States have any credibility doing this work? The work of pursuing racial equity and justice does not entail us lecturing or admonishing other governments. I believe it is critical to approach this work with great humility, as we still have a lot of work to do here at home to fully address the realities of systemic racism. I also think it's important to acknowledge that we are not the only country struggling with these challenges. To paraphrase former President Jimmy Carter, why should our efforts and commitment to eliminate racism end at our borders? Furthermore, while the U.S. government hasn't always gotten it right, our civil society has always been a source of pride and inspiration for oppressed people around the world. The United States has a robust and diverse civil society that calls us to task, with whom we at the State Department are regularly engaged. The heinous murder of George Floyd stirred the conscience of tens of millions of Americans and marked a turning point in this country's attitude toward racial justice. George Floyd's last gasps gave air to a rallying cry yelled around the world to finally stamp out the scourge of racism once and for all. Civil society ensured that governments would not and could not look away. They keep us honest, and I wouldn't be doing this job if we weren't making strides here at home. Finally, people often want to know if the State Department is only focused on racial equity and justice. The answer to that is absolutely not. I am only one member of a team of department officials tasked with exploring ways U.S. foreign policy can help build a more just and equitable world. We fundamentally believe that when we defend equal rights of all people around the world, of women and girls in all their diversity, people of African descent, LGBTQI+ individuals, indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and people of every ethnic background and religion, we ensure that those rights are protected for ourselves and our children here in America. Jessica Stern is our special envoy to advance the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons. Rashad Hussain is the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Ambassador Deborah Lipstock is the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Sarah Mankara is the special advisor on international disability rights. Kat Fotovac is the senior official in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. Kelly Faye Rodriguez is our special representative for international labor affairs. And Abby Fickenauer is our special envoy for global youth issues. Maya Angelou once said that none of us can be free until everybody is free. And because I wholeheartedly agree, it's the case I make everywhere I go. So why am I so passionate about this work? As a Black American woman who is the descendant of enslaved people, this work is deeply personal to me. We are here because of centuries of people of African descent's activism and demands for justice and equality. Let us never forget that we stand here on the shoulders of our ancestors. My grandfather wrote a weekly column in Los Angeles' oldest and largest Black newspaper for 30 years on issues impacting our community. He died only 2 weeks before the horrific murder of George Floyd. So it's only right that I invoke him every chance that I get. And today, I will share a quote from one of his last columns in which he said, quote, "Black Americans are proud of their heritage and confident of their future. And wherever you look, you will find them working, playing, worshiping, dreaming, creating, and expressing their cherished freedom in the spirit of the country they would like to help make a model for democratic peoples everywhere." End quote. While he was talking specifically about Black Americans, I think this rings true for people of African descent everywhere around the world. During my sophomore year of college, I was awarded the Pickering Fellowship for Foreign Affairs, a fellowship for students from historically underrepresented communities to join the Foreign Service. It felt like a miracle that me, a little Black girl from Inglewood, California, was going to become a United States diplomat. I was so thrilled to share my good news with my grandfather, my hero and my inspiration, a Black activist who dedicated his life to the relentless pursuit of justice and equality. But he reacted with disappointment. He told me that there were problems in my own community and encouraged me to focus my talents and energy at home. I decided to do both. Pursue a career in foreign policy while never losing touch with the struggles here at home. I view myself as part of a global coalition of anti-racist practitioners who bear this enormous responsibility given the urgency of this work, the rarity of this moment, and what's at stake. And I hope that I've made my grandfather proud, because he also taught me that advocacy has no limits. And, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So why are we doing this work at the State Department? Like my beloved grandfather, there are many people who question the need for our diplomats to focus on racism in other countries. Why should the State Department be spending time, energy, and resources examining the effects of systemic racism and promoting equity around the world? The State Department's top priority is the protection of Americans and American interests. We are doing this work because our country is diverse and multiracial. This work is about helping to eliminate racism, discrimination, and xenophobia everywhere for the safety of U.S. citizens inside and outside our borders. We are doing this work to promote inclusive democracy, human rights, and political and economic stability around the world. Another important reason my role exists is because while we acknowledge the very real and ongoing challenges we are facing here in the United States to fully address the long and lingering legacies of the displacement of Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans and their descendants, we also recognize that these challenges are not unique to the United States. It's not just us. Structural racism, discrimination, and xenophobia are global scourges that require global solutions. We seek to be a positive and productive member of a global community working to address racial and ethnic inequities as a means to a more just and peaceful world for all. And we are trying to show our commitment not by the example of our power, but by the power of our example, by doing the hard but necessary work to address systemic racism here at home openly and honestly. I agree with my boss, Secretary Blinken, that structural racism weakens societies. It makes democracies less prosperous, less stable, less equitable. It fosters polarization and distrust. And it robs democracies of the strength, the innovation, and the creativity that can be drawn from diverse and inclusive communities and workplaces. At the individual level, racism undermines the full enjoyment of dignity and human rights for members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities. Promoting respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms allows these communities to live up to their full potential, which improves the individual's livelihood and consequently benefits all of society. Now, because of the metastatic nature of racism, discrimination, and xenophobia, a concerted and urgent effort on the part of the entire global coalition of anti-racist governments, our communities, and our institutions is required to address this challenge. Strengthening inclusive democracies worldwide is a core tenet of the Biden administration's foreign policy and the work I am leading to advance racial equity and justice. To advance this goal, foreign affairs agencies are using American leadership abroad to advance equity, human rights, and full inclusion for communities that are underserved or face barriers to inclusion. This work is critical to ensuring and bolstering our peace and security. When we invest in the healthcare systems in other regions of the world, we are better protecting Americans from borderless pandemics. When we help make political participation more inclusive in every corner of the globe, we're helping to decrease the likelihood that members of marginalized communities will find belonging among illicit groups that threaten our national security. Our nation will be safer and more prosperous when we address the deep-rooted inequities that are caused by global racism. Fortifying policies globally that support societies free from racism, discrimination, and xenophobia will reduce corruption, economic-driven migration, and authoritarianism, and the disproportionate effects these ills have on underserved communities. American prosperity is greater when we work collectively and inclusively. This is also true around the world. When the world does better, America does better. It's a win-win for everyone. And how are we doing this? The Biden-Harris administration is serious about closing the gap between the promises of America and the reality on the ground for far too many Americans. We've taken steps, and we continue to take steps, to acknowledge and address systemic racism and the scourge of white supremacy in our own country. Racial equity is not an issue for one single department in our administration. It is now the business of the whole of government and all of our federal policies and institutions. On his very first day in office, President Biden signed Executive Order 13985, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, an ambitious whole-of-government equity agenda. To that end, Secretary Blinken released the State Department's Equity Action Plan in April of last year, outlining priorities, including the establishment of the department's first agency priority goal to advance equity in U.S. foreign policies, programs, and processes, and announcing plans to appoint a special representative for racial equity and justice, the position which I am now honored to occupy. As the President has said, advancing equity is not a one-year project. It's a generational commitment. To double down on his commitment to strengthen the federal government's ability to address the barriers that underserved communities continue to face, President Biden followed up with a new executive order just last month entitled Further Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government. In order to advance this administration priority, Secretary Blinken instructed me to embed racial equity in our policies and programs by requiring State Department bureaus to work with my team to establish bureau-specific frameworks for short, medium, and long-term implementation of the two executive orders. When my colleagues and I sit down to explore ways to improve the livelihoods of marginalized, racialized communities around the world, we often do a deep dive into the local history and context to identify the causal chain, which is defined as the path of influence running from a root cause to problem symptoms. Symptoms, in this case, often look like poverty, concentrated unemployment, inhumane working conditions, lack of access to adequate education, and poor health outcomes, just to name a few. Key to understanding this causal chain is regular consultations with affected communities. Communities who are best placed to identify and analyze the challenges and generate the opportunities to achieve equality. We are indeed facing an inflection point. Just as our country was faced with deciding on a new system of American values during Reconstruction, we find ourselves now at another crossroads. As the president said, quote, "What many people hadn't seen before or simply refused to see cannot be ignored any longer. You see it in so many places." It's absolutely true, and you see it in so many places in American life, but this is also the case globally. While members of marginalized racial and ethnic and indigenous groups were being intentionally cut out of the American dream here in the United States, there was also similar violent colonization and racial subjugation happening in territories across the Americas, Africa, and Asia that European countries claimed as their own. The infrastructures, the legal systems, and the social norms were all tailored solely for the purposes of exploiting fellow human beings and extracting their natural resources, including human resources. Identifying the causal chains is a huge step in the right direction, but it means nothing if we then don't take the necessary steps to try and make things right. That's why one of my team's top priorities is identifying ways to actually address persistent structural racism and its continuing effects on marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities around the world. We've seen that it is possible for governments to target with surgical precision specific demographics with political, social, and economic policies for the betterment or to the detriment of their livelihoods. For example, the massive wealth gap we see today between Black and white Americans can be traced back to the fact that Black Americans were largely excluded from the wealth creation policies implemented for about the first 100 years after the Civil War. And as President Biden said at the 100th anniversary of the tragic Tulsa massacre, quote, "That hate became embedded systematically and systemically in our laws and culture," end quote. Today, our government is working to close that gap, root out the systemic racism baked into our laws, and even the playing field here at home and around the globe so that all people can be free to reach their full potential. We do this because we believe that when any segment of society is denied the chance to live up to their full potential, the entire society is held back. That's why in the U.S., we are working to advance effective, accountable policing and criminal justice practices that will build public trust and strengthen public safety for all communities. The Department of Justice is reducing language barriers that make it difficult for individuals with limited English proficiency to better access justice, communicate public safety concerns, and vindicate their rights. At the same time, in South America, the State Department works to promote diversity in security forces, build the capacity of local civil society organizations, expand political participation and representation for marginalized groups, and protect civil society leaders and human rights defenders from harm. In Europe, we're working to counter anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, xenophobia, and discrimination against members of other marginalized religious and ethnic groups, and racism, including anti-Roma racism. We're also working with European partners to share best practices and recommendations to help address racial and ethnic motivated violence and extremism. All over the world, the State Department is investing in policies and programs aimed at protecting human rights, combating corruption, diffusing violence using critical communication skills, countering disinformation, de-escalation techniques, and recognizing and mitigating bias. We're allocating resources to help us learn more about and combat the ways institutional racism drives human trafficking and forced migration around the world. We know that climate change, the climate crisis, disproportionately impacts marginalized racial and ethnic communities, especially indigenous communities. That's why Vice President Harris made clear that, quote, "We must ground our work to address the climate crisis and our greatest environmental challenges in justice and equity," end quote. In order to effectively do that, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency established a new office dedicated to advancing environmental justice
and civil rights that will ensure the lived experiences of underserved communities are central to our decision-making while supporting community-driven solutions. Similarly, we seek meaningful partnerships with Indigenous communities globally to protect the environment in ways that honor and incorporate Indigenous knowledge. Domestically, the Biden-Harris administration is advancing equity and closing gaps made worse by the pandemic in order to help promote student achievement and ensure America's education system meets the demands of today's global economy. Meanwhile, the State Department is providing grants, trainings, and resources to help U.S. higher education institutions increase and diversify their study abroad programs. We are also working to empower the next generation and establish long-lasting ties between the United States and other countries. Our exchange programs strive to embed equity in all aspects of their work and promote mutual understanding, leadership development, educational transformation, and democratic ideals. We host groups of social justice practitioners from around the world to encourage collaboration with each other and their American counterparts in efforts to dismantle systemic racism and advance civil rights in their own countries. We have programs in South Asia that aim to promote social and economic inclusion and foster greater tolerance and respect for multi-ethnic and multi-religious societies. Economic inequality disproportionately impacts members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities. But when we invest in inclusive economic development, we help reduce the likelihood of instability, violence, and mass migrations. Eliminating structural barriers to employment and economic opportunities can help countries unlock greater economic growth, which is good for everyone. Here at home, the United States government is increasing the share of federal contracting dollars awarded to small, disadvantaged businesses, including minority-owned businesses, by 50% by 2025, and thereby investing $100 million in such businesses to help close the racial wealth gap. The first 2 years of the Biden-Harris administration has marked record performance in terms of share of contracting dollars reaching small, disadvantaged businesses. Overseas, we're promoting private sector-led economic growth, helping our partner governments become even better trading and security partners, and encouraging inclusive, sustained, and resilient economic growth in developing countries. We're also advocating for workers' rights here at home and around the world. Across Africa and the Middle East, we are working to ensure protections and fair treatment of laborers of African descent and their families forced to migrate to escape conflict, climate crises, increasing food insecurity, and collapsing economies. For example, in the Sahel, our programs help to improve social integration and economic empowerment for former hereditary enslaved people, and strengthens the legal and political systems that identify and protect those vulnerable to slavery, exploitation, and re-enslavement. I saw firsthand in Peru last fall how impactful our economic development assistance can be. During a visit to a rural community outside of Lima, I met a number of Afro-Peruvian women who developed local businesses that promote female entrepreneurship with small funding from a U.S. government grant. Though the project ended more than 2 years ago, I've witnessed the growth and sustainability of 5 businesses created with only $25,000 in seed funds. I visited a seamstress workshop, a sandwich vending cart, a pig farm, a mini market, a restaurant, and a bakery. In all cases, the women running these businesses shared how the project changed their lives and their families' lives, economically and socially. Most notably, given that the town was previously a food desert, the mini market benefited the entire community by providing a safe, local place to shop for necessities without having to travel hours to another town. True democracy hinges on the premise that everyone has a say. Racism contradicts that very principle. The Biden-Harris administration understands that democracies require constant work and maintenance, and that it is incumbent upon everyone to forge more inclusive and open societies, including here in the United States. President Biden and his cabinet remain committed to using every tool at their disposal to protect Americans' right to vote. That's why 2 years ago, he signed an executive order directing a whole-of-government effort to promote access to voting. The Biden-Harris administration has made clear that renewing democracy in the United States and around the world is essential to meeting the unprecedented challenges of our time. That's why in the Middle East and North Africa, our programs support the development of laws and good governance processes that are inclusive of the needs of historically marginalized communities. Fostering inclusive democracies everywhere builds more stable, prosperous, and peaceful nations for all people, including Americans. In conclusion, being a champion for freedom also means meeting this new moment of spreading authoritarianism. We must continue to lead with diplomacy rooted in America's most cherished democratic values, defending universal human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, championing opportunity for all, upholding universal human rights for all, respecting the rule of law, and treating every person with dignity. Though we've never fully lived up to those aspirations, we must continue to strive to make those ideals real for everyone. Our country and our world are at an inflection point. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." But I believe it is up to us to bend it. Because racism is ubiquitous and ever-evolving, we must all be constantly adapting. When racism moves the goalpost, we have to imagine new ways to become anti-racist. Achieving racial equity and support for underserved communities is not a one-time project. Systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia and their harmful effects on our everyday lives should never be an afterthought. Now, none of us were around when the roots of these causal chains were first taking shape. But we're all here now, and we're all in this together. We have to make a concerted effort across all fields of human endeavor to uproot the racialized inequities so deeply woven into our society. You may wonder why I, as a foreign policy practitioner, spent so much time today talking about U.S. history and ongoing challenges. It's because I believe that we've got to look at and understand ourselves in order to effectively lead the charge for compassionate and inclusive democracy globally. As Maya Angelou once said, quote, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, need not be lived again," end quote. The documentary, Who We Are, reminds us of the power of history when told truthfully, warts and all. It compels us to remember tragedies like Pequot Court. It is important that we remember these events so that we can better understand how we got to where we are today and to prevent us from making those same mistakes again. That part isn't hard. We just have to know the difference between fact and fiction and right from wrong. The hard part is finding creative ways to administer justice for past wrongs and implement equitable public policy in the future. We can take the next big step in America's journey toward liberty and justice for all, or we can squander it. If we do the latter, future generations will face an even wider inequality gap and greater political instability. We owe them better than that. When bigotry, hate, and indifference win, everyone loses. But if we harness the power of our collective brilliance in pursuit of equality and justice, with history in clear rear view, facing the future head on, we can build a better world than the one that we've got right now. James Baldwin once said, quote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced, end quote. This work is not easy. It will not be quick, but I know it can be done, and I know we'll have to do it together. Thank you. Thank you.
Sit. Can I sit? Is it fine if I sit? Yeah. These weren't made for lecturing. Yeah, or you can use this mic and I can project. How about that? Or we can share it.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Smith. Thank you for your wonderful inside keynote. My name is Maria Antonia. I'm from Brazil. I studied at University of São Paulo. And I have two questions for you. I'm going to share with my colleague Antonio. I'm going to make the first one and he's going to do the following one. How can our own Ministry of Foreign Affairs prepare to implement affirmative actions and expand in admission exam to diplomatic careers? What should be avoided and how to respond to the pressures against it?
And when you say our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you're talking about the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I can make the second one. Hi, Smith, thanks for the keynote. Well, and the second question is really connected to the first one. Beyond affirmative action, what can the Department of State here in the U.S. and other ministries of foreign affairs around the world do to ensure that racial justice and diversity efforts will continue to shape the future diplomatic bodies without being reversed or dismissed as presidential administrations change? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. For the second question, there's no way that we can guarantee what future administrations will and won't do. That's just the reality, and I think the last administration in particular showed us that, right? But I think the last administration also underscored the importance of making changes that will stick, and that can really be embedded. And I will note, I wasn't at the State Department during the last administration, but I was pleasantly surprised to hear that the last administration actually did expand the number of Pickering and Rangel Fellows, which is one of the premier fellowships at the State Department to encourage people from underrepresented backgrounds to join the Foreign Service. And they did that because even they acknowledged that a more diverse workforce is actually better, leads to better outcomes. In terms of how we can encourage the Brazilian Foreign Ministry to also harness Brazil's beautiful and unique and rich diversity, I would say that we now have an opportunity with the new administration there. I like to say, and even though I'm not a politician, elections do matter. Elections matter, and I think that was so crystal clear in the election in Brazil. I'll give you one example. When I first got appointed to this role, I had the honor of meeting with a Brazilian Foreign Ministry official in Washington, and this was under the previous administration. And I said, one of the things I'd like to talk to you about is the shared challenge that both of our countries are facing when it comes to racism. And we have noticed a shared trend, a really disturbing trend in violence against Black trans women in particular. And it was so bizarre how he said, no, that doesn't happen in Brazil. And I said, no, I'm not, we're struggling with it too. I'm not trying to play the blame game here. I'm saying that this is a shared problem in both of our countries. Perhaps there are things we can do together to address it. But there was a complete lack or unwillingness to even acknowledge the problem. Now, since the election, Brazil has a whole minister for racial equality. And she's wonderful. And she came to DC and had so many ideas on things we can do together. And it was just a night and day difference of the tone and the spirit of collaboration and cooperation on addressing, again, these shared challenges. And another stark contrast, sticking with Brazil, if I may, is I had the honor of meeting with a delegation from the the Yanomami tribe in northern Brazil. that is facing incredible challenges right now in terms of health, in terms of security, that really proliferated under the last administration. And they were sharing with us the difference that they saw in the responses from the administrations. So previously, it was help us convince the administration to, put an end to the illegal mining, to acknowledge the health crisis that we are currently experiencing. And now their request to us was help this administration in their efforts. They are there with us. They are trying to kick out the illegal miners, and they're trying to address the health crises, but they need your support. That's a completely different partnership and tone. So I will say elections matter. I do think that you now have an administration that acknowledges that for far too long, too many Brazilians of color were locked out of opportunities, and that, similar to our country, that undermined us, right? We are less prosperous. We are weaker when we don't allow everyone to live up to their full potential. And I hope that Brazil continues this spirit of partnership, and that in addition to the partnership that I have with the Minister of Racial Equality, that the Brazilian Foreign Ministry engages in a partnership with our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, which we've seen some other countries across Latin America do as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Ms. Cormier-Smith. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. Really appreciated the keynote. I have a question that's fairly inspired by the last panel that we just had on development. I'm wondering what your opinions are on, do you think that equity and inclusion look more or less the same across all geographies? And if not, if you don't think that, who is determining the State Department's goals and approaches in different geographies, and how are those goals and approaches being determined?
That's such a good question. The short answer is no. It cannot look the same. I'm very intentional about not applying a one-size-fits-all approach to this work, because even though we know that racism is a global challenge, we also know that it looks very different in every country in the world. And so for that reason, a one-size-fits-all approach would fail, right? I also am very intentional about us not applying an American lens to this problem, because that would also fail. So what this work looks like in terms of the priorities and goals and measures of monitoring that and evaluating that necessarily looks different across each region. And that makes the work harder. It has made it a much more difficult process for my team to determine our regional priorities, but for me it was very important that we do that in close collaboration with the regional bureaus, because they know these regions better than we do. They know which countries we have the best likelihood of success in, right? So again, going back to the Brazil example, because it's just so stark, would we have prioritized Brazil if there was another administration? I don't know. But we now have a country where there's clearly pain, right? Like there's clearly issues of systemic racism, but we also now have a willing partner to acknowledge that and address it together. So that, I think those are like really two important criteria that we are applying to countries to determine our priorities. It's also critically important to us that this work be informed and led by local marginalized racial and ethnic community and indigenous communities themselves. For far too long, these communities have been told, they have been told what's best for them. They have been excluded from the rooms where the decisions are being made, and we see where that's gotten us, right? These communities have agency, they have voices. And so part of my job, my goal for this work is to bring those voices in a meaningful way. Because you have to remember, participation is not automatically power, right? People always talk about being in the room, but you're brought in the room, where are you placed? Do you have a seat at the table? Is the table high and your seat is low and everyone else's seat is here? So it's also about meaningful engagement with these communities, and then including them in an ongoing discussion for the evaluation process. right? Engaging them and asking them how things are going, if there has been a noticeable change after our policies have shifted, and if not, what we can do differently. So this work is hard. This work is not easy. I have been in the role for almost 9 months now, and I, often get frustrated with the pace of change, but I'm often reminded of this African proverb that's like pasted in the Johannesburg airport that I would see every time I flew in there, and it said, and I don't even know if it's a real African proverb or if it was one that the bank just created because it looked cool and it sounded nice, but it's true in this work, and it is, if you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast, go alone. And I'd rather this work goes far.
Hi, my name is Carolina. Thank you so much for speaking with us and sharing your time with us. In our previous panel, as was mentioned, we were talking about localization and international development. And so I'm thinking a lot about how the State Department can apply a localization lens, especially when it comes to listening to people. I've done a couple State Department language learning programs in the past, and I think and my focus is on the Middle East and North Africa, and I think so often the listening piece is missing. And so what do you hope for the future, especially when at times listening and learning from people might not be in the U.S. foreign policy interests, especially in the Middle East, of how we can apply that localization approach?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the difficult things about this work, right? It's convincing my colleagues to take the extra time and do the extra work that comes with listening first and meaningful engagement. And that's going to be a culture shift. That is going to be something that I think we can only robustly do once you all come into the State Department, right? Like, that's going to be a generational shift, because that, as you noted, that's not how things are done. And so a lot of my work and my team's work is convincing our colleagues, frankly, of the value of this work, of the importance of this work, and that this is a national security tenet. It's an imperative, right? It's not a sort of afterthought. It's not a nice thing to do. We have seen the failures that result when we don't engage with these communities. And you would think that would be enough. It's not yet, but we continue to try and find things, the data, the anecdotes that will compel our colleagues. But, again, this is not easy work, and it's not going to be quick changes. It really does take a paradigm shift.
Hi, Ms. Smith. Thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Valentina. I go to TAPS. And it struck with me when you were discussing your conversation with your grandfather when you decided to go work in the U.S. State Department about community versus national. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience balancing both and the difficulties you found with it.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I try to maintain the balance, again, by never losing sight of what's going on here at home. I know inherently that my credibility to do this work depends on how we are doing here at home in terms of addressing systemic racism. It's why, even though I don't have a domestic component in my portfolio, I maintain very close communication with the Domestic Policy Council at the White House, and I try to keep abreast of everything that we're doing, but also use that channel to dissent to things that I feel like undermine, right, our rhetoric or what we're trying to do. I don't always, it's not always effective, but at least I can say the thing. I also am reminded of the similarities of the challenges that we face here in the United States and everywhere I go. And again, without applying an American lens, it is striking to me how when I traveled to Colombia, it felt very familiar, right? When I traveled to South Africa, the racism, the discrimination, it felt very familiar. And I think part of that made me sad because I was like, wow, this is truly a global challenge. But another part of me felt a little relieved. I don't know if that's the right word, because I was like, wait, this is familiar. I know how to deal with this, right? At least this is an enemy that I've seen before, right? It may have a little different variation, but it's a familiar enemy. And that's particularly true of anti-Black racism. That is almost the constant I see wherever I go. That one is really hard to deal with, because it just shows the insidiousness and the persistence and the long lingering legacies of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. But again, I've tried to operate and use that sense of familiarity while not leading with it, right? So using that sense of familiarity to connect with these communities and making sure that I'm always approaching this work with great humility, and always starting from the point of acknowledging that the United States is struggling with a lot of these same challenges, and there could be an opportunity for us to engage in some kind of partnership, in some kind of lesson sharing, best practices sharing, exchange of ideas. That's much more powerful and much more effective than me going around and saying, this country's so racist, and like the US government is going to cut all assistance because you're so racist, right? That's just, that's not realistic. So just trying to, again, use the familiarity of my lived experience to connect with these communities as I engage with them. And then again, using what I find overseas, what I hear overseas, what I learn overseas, to somehow bring it back home and make us better. That's how I've been trying to do both, right? But it is hard. And I hear that this part, particularly of my story, resonates with a lot of young people, and particularly young people from, marginalized communities, when they have to go home and answer their families as to why they decided to pursue foreign policy instead of working here at home. And I also do this because I deeply believe in the interconnectedness of us all. So I believe that when an indigenous person in Malawi is more free and has access to their basic rights and can live with dignity, I believe that that is good for me too. So that also helps.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. I was wondering if you'd be able to expand on implementation evaluation measures or strategies that is taking to ensure that the racial equity and justice frameworks that you outlined in your talk are actually employed in programs and policies that they're being continually acted on.
Yeah. So we have a couple ways that we're trying to do this. So one are these bureau-specific frameworks that I mentioned in my remarks. So this is a State Department-specific mandate that Secretary Blinken has instructed all bureaus to do. So that way, again, we're not applying a one-size-fits-all approach to this work, but we're, forcing our colleagues in the bureaus to think strategically and creatively about how they apply this work, this lens, to the work that they're doing every day. And that's necessarily going to look different from the Bureau of African Affairs to the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs to the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, right? Like it needs to look different, but it also needs to be led by the bureaus themselves, because they know their portfolios better than I or my team do. The other thing we have to keep us accountable is the executive order. And that comes from the White House. That is mandated by President Biden and by, and that is something that is a whole of government mandate. So the State Department is not exempt from that. And under the new executive order that was just issued last month, I believe there is now a new reporting requirement to keep agencies on task and to show that we are not only implementing it, but holding ourselves accountable and measuring the successes. So that is going to be a beast of a project. I am honored to be leading it for the State Department, but it also is quite daunting, right? Because the important thing that I always remind my colleagues is that that Executive Order 13985 and the second one on further advancing racial equity also includes that other important piece in support for underserved communities. It's not just racial equity. So under this second executive order, the goal is to kind of better coordinate all of the equity work and put it under one umbrella so that we are not being duplicative, but also we're making sure that we're taking an intersectional approach. So even though I'll be leading the work, I'm going to be relying heavily on my colleagues who lead our gender work, who lead our LGBTQI plus work, who lead our disability rights work, right? And if they don't contribute to it, we will fail.
Hi, my name's Ishan. I'm a freshman. Thanks so much for such an insightful address. I had a question regarding what you said about histories. Obviously, I feel that they're very important, but with the current tide of authoritarianism, waves of polarization sweeping all over the world, I wanted to ask how do you see the potential for reform within society to tell these histories so that they're not in danger of being erased?
That's a tough question, and it really depends on what country we're talking about, right? This is also why it's so important that for this work, it starts with conversations with these communities. Because the basic premise of this work has to be do no harm. And I do believe that if we go out into the world like cowboys and try and apply an American lens to this problem everywhere, we will do harm, right? Because there are certain marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities that may not want public support from the United States. They may not want public recognition, right? That may actually be counterproductive to their goals. So we have to talk to them and start the work by the conversation and listening to them to understand, again, what it is, the challenges they're facing are, and then how we can be helpful. And, one of the things that is really important is also acknowledging the global nature of this. And that includes the rising tide in authoritarianism and this sort of backlash on truth-telling in our history and who gets to control the narrative. And who gets to write history and who gets to rewrite history, right? This is something obviously we're struggling with in the United States, but again, I was surprised but kind of relieved to hear that it's not just us. I heard this loud and clear in Peru, actually, when I met with Afro-Peruvians who told me that one of their biggest challenges was feeling erased, completely unacknowledged in Peru's history, in the history books, in the current society, and they felt completely invisible. That sounded, again, very familiar for me. I think a lot of our Native American brothers and sisters in particular, but also Black Americans, feel erased from certain narratives of history, right? And if we are mentioned, it's only the oppressive parts, or maybe just a blip, or maybe just during Black History Month. That is true for a lot of marginalized communities around the world. And again, how they think best to approach that and to push back on that has to be informed by them.
Thank you. It's been your honesty and the substance behind what you do and what we're trying to do as a nation has been exciting to hear about and inspiring. My name is Chad Bissonette. I was a panelist for the last panel that just took place. I run an international organization that supports and advocates for a community-led approach to development. Your job seems so daunting.
Yes.
I mean, it's big picture stuff. It's global stuff. You're working within a known bureaucracy. What experience? What are some of the examples of your past professional experiences that were so important to you that you brought over that have helped you in this current position?
Even before I took this position, because of my upbringing and because the influence that my grandfather had on me, I always tried to infuse racial justice into everything that I did. And sometimes, I had to be sneakier about it than other times, but what that experience taught me was the power of just saying the thing, of having the courage to say the thing that feels a little racisty or unjust, but no one is comfortable enough to say it. So I just remember countless times in professional settings where, I'll give you one example. I was in a meeting with, and this was prior to me taking this role, but I think, again, informed my skill set and the things that I bring to this role. I was in a meeting with a bunch of my colleagues, including my boss at the time, with a think tank. And at the time, the think tank was talking about upcoming elections, I think, in Nigeria. And he made a comment, the head of the think tank, who was an older white man, made a comment along the lines of, they're all just so corrupt. And no one said anything. And so I was waiting because I was like, I know everyone heard that. Someone's going to say it, right? Someone more senior is going to say it. And no one said anything. So I just said it. And I went off mute and I said, I'm sorry, I can't let that slide. What you said was incredibly offensive and racist, frankly. And he was flabbergasted that I called him up. But I had to say the thing. And afterwards, every single one of my colleagues sent me an email saying, thank you so much for saying that. I was thinking the same thing. And I was so frustrated because I was one of the most junior people on the call. And they had the seniority to say that thing and not have me be vulnerable and say it. So I think saying the thing and just seeing the power of having the courage to say the thing throughout my career has helped me incredibly in this role. The other interesting thing that I think has served me well is my experience at starting my career as a Foreign Service officer. So being of the bureaucracy and knowing the bureaucracy intimately has helped me better understand it and better navigate it in a way that some of my colleagues who are first-time appointees struggle with. And one of the experiences that immediately popped into mind when you asked the question was during my first tour as a Foreign Service officer in Tijuana, Mexico, where I was, fresh out of grad school, and eager and wanting to do all the things and prove that I was so brilliant. And I was a consular officer at the time, but I asked the public diplomacy head what the consulate's plans were for Black History Month. Because I figured, we're in Tijuana, we are literally the closest U.S. consulate to the United States. We must go really big for like our heritage months, right? And he said, we don't have anything planned. And I was shocked. And I was like, well, why not? And he was like, I don't know, I just haven't thought about it. And so I said, well, can I do something? And he said, sure. And so I put together a really thoughtful plan that included bringing down one of my grandfather's friends who was one of the freedom riders from the freedom rides in the 60s, and bringing down a 30-person gospel choir from LA to perform in Tijuana, Mexico. And I wrote up this proposal and requested the budget. They gave it to me, and it was a huge success. I mean, it was a massive success that the next year they doubled my budget and I went on a 3-city tour with this gospel choir. And it was incredible. And it taught me the importance of when you see a gap, having the courage and the willingness to fill it. So not just pointing it out, but saying, okay, this is a gap, this is a problem, and then I want to do it. And so that has been critical in this role because this was the gap. We never had anyone focused on racism. We had one focused on every other marginalized population, but we didn't have anyone focused on global racialized populations. I saw that gap, and so I said, hey, that's a problem. We need to fill that gap. And so I did the quiet advocacy work of advocating for the creation of this position, not knowing or not wanting the position, but just wanting it to get created. And that was because that experience in Tijuana, where I saw the gap, and instead of just saying, man, that sucks, we're not doing anything, being the one to fill the gap. And so I think that is one lesson that I would impart on all of you today, especially as you enter your careers. You will enter institutions that are flawed. You will enter institutions that were not made for you, in many cases, and you will notice gaps. You will notice flaws. You will notice problems. Don't be afraid to propose those solutions and fill those gaps.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cornelius-Smith. And we had a round of applause. That was incredible. Thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for your great questions. It's been such a lovely, lovely keynote address. So I want to thank and I want to respect, obviously, your time. So thank you to everyone who came out. Thank you again.
Thank you.
It's been such an honor. So we'll take a break for right now. But thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you.
We're going to do an epic picture with everybody.
Oh, okay.
And until a picture with everybody.
Okay, great. So first photos.
All right, thank you. All right, everybody, epic quickly down.